Welcome to the Sandwich Lease Option lesson. In order to get the most out of this lesson, you should have a functional knowledge of lease options and their respective contracts. If you need to go back and review the lease option lesson, please take the time to do so. When you are ready to continue with this lesson and learn how to use a lease option to both enter and exit a deal, click Continue. Enjoy learning about this exciting way to make a lot of money in any real estate market.
Welcome to the Sandwich Lease Options lesson. My name is Janet, and I'm excited to be able to present this very exciting lesson to you so that you too can benefit from the flexibility and profitability Sandwich Lease Options offer. However, before starting this lesson, it will be to your benefit to make sure that you have a functioning knowledge of the following items. It's important at this point to have a good grasp of the basic principles and terminology used in real estate investing. Keep in mind that if you come across a term in this lesson that you don't understand, you can use the glossary to learn more about it. You should understand generally what properties to look for and why. Much of this information is included in the Lease Options Introduction lesson, but we will review it here as it pertains to Sandwich Lease Options specifically. Along with knowing what property to look for, where the best places to look for property are, some areas are better for different investment techniques. By knowing which areas are more beneficial for the technique you plan on using, you can eliminate a lot of frustration and potential risk. As you visit the best investing areas, you will also need to know how to find the motivated sellers in those areas. Keep in mind that there are specific seller traits that work best for lease option. The same holds true for sandwich lease options, and it's important you know who to look for and how to get their attention. Another important thing for you to know is how to do income property analysis. Running numbers on a property is one of the surest ways to know if you can make money on it. And with sandwich lease options, you will need to run numbers to both enter and exit the deal. Finally, you should know the basics of lease options. Since sandwich lease options are an extension of a traditional lease option, you should be very familiar with the basics before trying something more complex.
My name is Bob Grimm, and as with Janet, I would like to welcome you to this lesson, one of the more lucrative lessons in the financing course. We are going to cover some interesting information in this one, so I hope you're ready to learn. Speaking of learning, here are just some of the main points Janet and I will cover in this lesson. First, you will learn what sandwich lease options are. You heard a little bit about them in the lease option introduction lesson, but we will go into much more depth into this fantastic investing technique in this lesson. Second, you will leave this lesson being able to identify the advantages and challenges sandwich lease options present. Knowing the advantages and challenges can help you decide if working with sandwich lease options is a technique you want to profit from. Third, you will learn how the various contracts function on both sides of a sandwich lease option. Janet and I will walk you through an example of a transaction so you can really see where each contract comes into play and how to set it up to be most beneficial to you. Finally, you will learn how to protect you and your other investments as well as your sandwich lease option. Now, I realize that sounds a little scary, like maybe sandwich lease options are risky ventures. That is not the case. Rather, Janet and I will teach you how to make sure you dot the proverbial I's and cross the proverbial T's so that everything you do is above board. Armed with that information, you will set out to make money hand over fist with sandwich lease options, if you so choose to. So with nothing further, Janet will start us off with our tips for success.
Thanks, Bob. Let me start by saying that anytime you think about entering into a real estate transaction, you should have a detailed plan for how you are going to exit or finish that transaction. Part of your plan should include knowing who's going to be your end buyer, which is why having a good buyer's list is so important, especially when working with sandwich lease options. Other reasons a buyer's list is important when working with sandwich lease options include knowing what your buyer wants, and when they want it so that you can structure the deal around those desires as much as possible. Having a buyer's list also allows you to screen buyers so that you know what their down payment and monthly payment abilities are. This can help you qualify certain buyers for certain properties and begin making money from those properties quicker. Our final tip for this lesson is to develop a clear understanding with the people on your buyer's list so that you can negotiate with them better by knowing what they expect and what you can give and demand.
All right, let's go ahead and get into the good stuff here. A sandwich lease option is technically defined as a lease held by a lessee, also a tenant buyer, who becomes a lessor or landlord by way of subletting a property. That may be a little confusing, so let me break it down for you with a quick example. You as the investor find a property for sale. You contact the owner and set up a lease option with them where you are the tenant buyer. Now, instead of moving into the property, you simply sublet it to another tenant buyer and make money on the difference. The end tenant buyer pays you versus the amount you are required to pay the original owner. Therefore, you as the investor play the middleman who sets everything up and profits from the second lease and eventual sale of the property. Now, when properly done, a sandwich lease option has two sets of completed agreements. One set is between the investor and the property owner that gives control, but not ownership of the property to the investor. And then a second set between the investor and end buyer that also gives control of the property, but not full ownership. And as you recall from the lease option lesson, having control of a property means you can live in the property or sublet it and make modifications to it, but your name does not appear on the deed. Janet, will you go through an example to show more fully how sandwich lease options work and how they give the leaseholder control of a property without full ownership?
I certainly will. For this example, assume you are the investor, and let's say you find a home seller. We call her Sally, who is willing to let you control her property through a lease option. As part of the deal, you agree to pay Sally a down payment of $1,700, $700 first month's rent, and a $1,000 option consideration, and $700 a month rent. Additionally, Sally allows you $250 in rent credit each month you pay on time and an end purchase or option price of $75,000 after the lease term of 1 year. Now, once that agreement is in place, you go to your buyer's list and contact one of your buyers. We'll call him Bob, who you feel is a good fit for this property because you know that Bob can't currently qualify for a traditional mortgage loan. Bob takes a look at the property and asks about the terms you are offering. You tell him that all he needs is a $3,800 down payment, $800 first month's rent, and $3,000 as an option consideration. $800 a month in rent, with $100 of that going to credit each month if it is paid on time, and an end purchase price of $89,000 after 10 months. Bob evaluates the terms and likes them, so you sign a lease option agreement with him, and just like that, you have created a successful sandwich lease option. And while that's great, let me make it a bit better and show your profit from this easy deal. By taking the difference in what you pay to Sally and what Bob pays to you, you get the following: $2,100 up front, $1,000 total from monthly rent payments, and $11,900 from the end sale of the property. So in just 10 short months, you made a take-home profit of $15,000, and it only took an initial $1,700 to get into it. And what was your risk in the deal? $1,700 and the fact that it might take more than 1 month to get a tenant buyer. But if you had already made a good buyer's list, even that worry is significantly reduced. Hopefully, this goes to show how important creating a solid buyer's list is to working effective sandwich lease options. Now, that was a hypothetical example, but Bob will tell you about someone just like you and me who made this strategy work for them in real life.
I sure will, Janet. This is an exciting story of how sandwich lease options worked for a guy named Michael. Michael was in a position much like you might be feeling right now. He wasn't totally clear on the details of sandwich lease options, but he knew they were highly profitable and decided to just go for it. Here's how it happened. One day as Michael was driving around, he happened to see a townhouse for sale with an out-of-state number listed on it. He decided to call the number and ask if the owner would be interested in lease optioning the property to him and allowing him to lease the property to someone else. The seller agreed, and through a series of communications, the details were worked out. The asking price on the townhouse was $95,000, but Michael negotiated a price of $91,000 in 3 years or sooner if sold. The seller required Michael to pay $3,000 as an option consideration, which he gladly did. Michael did a little painting and cleaning on the property and then entered into a lease option with a tenant buyer just a couple of weeks later. The end tenant buyer only stayed in the property for 9 months, but during that time, Michael was able to collect the rent on time and make around $50 a month in the process. After the 9th month, the tenant buyer called and said that she just couldn't afford the rent anymore and needed to move into something less expensive. Michael let her out of her lease agreement without penalty, but kept the $3,000 option consideration money as they had initially agreed. Michael then put out 2 ads, one that said the property was for rent and the other that said the property was for sale. He got calls from each ad, and after screening the callers, he found one good candidate interested in renting and one interested in buying. The buyer was another investor. So Michael exercised his option and purchased the property, then immediately resold it to the investor. But he also mentioned that he had a renter available if the investor was interested. The investor said he was interested and was willing to give Michael an extra $500 for the quality referral. Michael then set up the closing with a title attorney who required that all interested parties be present. They signed all necessary documents, and almost all closing costs were paid by the original seller and end buyer. At the end of the day, Michael walked out of the closing with a check for just over $12,000. Add that to the $3,450 he made from the first lease option, and in just 10 months, Michael used a sandwich lease option to make just over $15,450 in profit. So you should be able to see by now that sandwich lease options can be very profitable and an inexpensive way to invest in real estate. But aside from this huge benefit, there are several other benefits they present to both an investor and a tenant buyer. As soon as you are ready, click Next, and Janet will discuss some of those advantages.
As you have seen, sandwich lease options have some huge benefits associated with them, but there are also some challenges you need to be aware of before jumping right in. Bob and I will address each in this section, but to start out with, sandwich lease options carry almost all of the same advantages as traditional lease options. However, there are a few advantages that apply strictly to sandwich deals. These are the ones that we will discuss. The first main advantage to sandwich deals is that you can gain control of a property regardless of your personal financial and credit situation. Remember, you can enter a lease option for as little as 1 to 3% down and without credit checks. Thus, the most common excuse for not investing in real estate, I don't have any money and I can't get a loan, doesn't apply. Regardless of your situation, you get into and make money with sandwich lease options. Another huge benefit to a sandwich lease option is that if your tenant buyer doesn't pay, all you have to do is to evict them. Now, I realize we mentioned this benefit in the regular lease option lesson, but with a sandwich deal, we can take it one step further. Recall, in a sandwich deal, you don't own the property, so you are not ultimately responsible for the underlying mortgage. That means that in a worst-case scenario, you can't get someone in the property fast enough to continue making the payments. Your credit is not hurt by a foreclosure. You simply turn the property back over to the owner or get evicted in turn and move on to another property. Obviously, we don't recommend ever getting evicted, but it is nice to have that little security in the event that you need it. Also, in terms of finances, with a sandwich lease option, you typically won't have to worry about agent fees or closing costs. See, since you are offering such great terms to a large portion of the available market, there really is no need for an agent to help you list the property. Also, if you have taken the time to create a buyer's list, you can, in effect, be your own agent by contacting the interested buyers on your list. And in terms of closing costs, since you are playing the middleman, many times you can negotiate that the original owner and the end buyer pay the majority of the closing costs. These two savings combined can add thousands of dollars to your take-home profit.
Wow, those are some great benefits. However, sandwich lease options are not without their challenges, and it is only fair to make you aware of those challenges. In fact, you may already have thought of the first challenge, and that is when the tenant buyer decides to exercise their option and buy the property, you too are required to exercise your option and buy, since you can't legally sell a property you don't own. Now, you may only end up owning the property for a few minutes, but you still need to own it at some point before you sell it. So getting financing arranged for the purchase can be somewhat challenging, or at least time-consuming. But with the help of private lenders or hard money lenders, it is certainly possible, even if you have bad credit and no money. If you're not careful, another challenge can actually come about at the closing table. As you recall, in the lease option lesson, you were instructed to make your lease and option agreements very clear. Well, the same follows for your sandwich lease and option agreements. You need to make it very clear who will pay for what closing costs so that there is no confusion at the closing. Understand, some people are going to be shocked and even confused when they find out there is a third party involved if they haven't been told previously. Generally, this shock will not cause the deal to fall through, however, but it can be rather awkward if the end buyer is taken by surprise at closing, and it doesn't reflect well on you as an investor. A third challenge stems from the fact that you are not the property owner and therefore may have difficulty ensuring the underlying mortgage is being paid. Because, as you recall, you can't make the payment for them, else you run the risk of accelerating their mortgage, and you certainly don't want to do that. So do you just have to take it on their word that they will continue making the underlying payment? Of course not. That would fringe on accepting too much risk in the deal. Instead, you can set up an escrow account to help ensure the underlying payment gets made. There are also other options you can use to help protect your interest in a sandwich lease option deal, and Janet and I will discuss setting up an escrow account and some of your other protective options later in the lesson.
In addition to the challenges Bob just mentioned, there are some potential liabilities that, while quite rare, are important enough for you to understand them and how to avoid them. The first potential liability comes about if you guarantee the seller rent. Now, you may be thinking, well, this won't be a problem for me because I'm an honest person and there's no way that I would leave the seller high and dry on rent. If such is your standard of integrity, let me applaud you. But before you get too comfortable with that, let me ask what happens if your tenant buyer refuses to pay and you don't have the means of paying without driving your family to the streets. Thankfully, you really don't have to ponder too much on this scenario because there is a way out. When you create the lease agreement with the seller, have it set up on a performance basis. Basically, that means that when you get paid, you will pay the seller. Now, I know that you're thinking, who in their right mind would ever make such a deal? Well, those people who really need to sell or make money from their property, that's who. If your seller isn't motivated, it is highly unlikely that they would accept such terms, which is one more reason why it is important to focus your effort on those sellers who are, in fact, motivated. Now, when you present this idea of paying on a performance basis, you should be a little persuasive and say something to the effect of, you know, Steve Seller, if you hired a property manager to assist you, they won't guarantee anything, and they will collect 7 to 10% of whatever rent they do collect. But what I'm going to do is, and then present the performance-based payment idea. A second potential liability is the underlying or original mortgage that the owner is responsible for paying. It is to your benefit to find out if the loan interest rate is variable or fixed. Ideally, you don't want to work with a seller whose loan is variable because the payments can and will change. If the seller either doesn't make the payments or they get higher than what your monthly payment is and the seller ends up losing the home, well, that doesn't figure too well into your lease option. So if you come across a great deal where the property is on a variable interest rate, seriously consider trying to encourage the owner to refinance the property to a fixed rate loan before doing a sandwich deal with them. A third potential liability comes from the idea that while you may like the idea of entering a property via a lease option, but you really dislike the idea of being a landlord. If this is the case, but you can only afford to control properties via a lease option, then you can do what is called a cooperative assignment. A cooperative assignment is when you have a lease option with a seller, and then when you find a tenant buyer, simply assign the lease option to the tenant buyer and collect a fee for doing so. There's a slightly different paperwork involved in this kind of a deal, but it will be discussed in more detail in the options lesson.
A final potential liability to consider is, what happens if you only have the opportunity to work with expensive properties whose underlying mortgage payments are significantly more than can be supported by even higher than average market rents? Well, you may think that such a situation would prevent you from being able to work with sandwich lease options, but that is not true. You see, if the mortgage can't be covered by a high rent, then you can consider doing an equity split with the seller. An equity split in this case would be where the seller agrees to cover some of the negative cash flow now in exchange for some other benefit later. For example, you can offer them a percentage of your profit or a higher amount when the property sells or something similar. One good idea to consider when offering an equity split is to allow the seller to write down something they would like out of the deal by covering that negative cash flow. If what they write is feasible, you will have a much easier time getting them to actually agree to the equity split. Now let's look at a specific example of how an equity split can work. Let me give you this example in the language you might consider using on an agreement so you can see how it would be worded. You might consider something like this: landlord, or the seller, to receive 20% of the net profit generated from the sale of the home. This profit will be calculated by taking the gross sales price less all costs. Additionally, tenant, which is you as the investor, and landlord agree that the home will be sold for an amount that may be more or less than area comparables. However, the lowest price the tenant or investor will resell the house for is whatever price. For the example, let's say $400,000. And if the house should sell for less than this, the tenant agrees to pay landlord, under the terms of this agreement, the same amount as if it was sold for this amount. This example illustrates that the seller is guaranteed a profit of around $80,000, depending upon the actual sales price. That's a great deal in exchange for the seller paying some of the negative cash flow over a year or two while the lease option is in effect.
Now, there is one other item you need to keep in mind, especially as it pertains to an equity split scenario, and that is the agreement you make with the seller is between you and the seller, and the agreement you make with the tenant buyer is only between you and the tenant buyer. That is to say that whatever the tenant buyer does or doesn't do has no legal effect on what you are still responsible for with the seller. So, if the tenant buyer simply walks away from the property without being evicted, you are still responsible for making payments to the seller, which, of course, translates to the fact that if you can't make those payments, you run the risk of being evicted. And if you get evicted, you most likely will lose your option consideration money and anything else you have put into the property. Thus, it's very important for you to read and make sure you understand the terms of the lease agreement you sign and that your tenant buyer signs, especially considering the fact that some free agreements include phrases and allow a landlord to sue for unpaid rent if the tenant leaves the property without being evicted. You should look for this kind of clause in your lease agreement with the seller, and you should make sure it is in your lease agreement with the tenant buyer. Now that you are concerned about this aspect of sandwich lease options, let me say also that it is quite rare for these issues to arise. But since it does happen from time to time, you need to be aware of your agreements, how they are worded, and what can happen. Okay, now that you have a solid understanding of what sandwich lease options are and some of the benefits and challenges to using them, let's go ahead and walk through mechanics of a deal to see how it all fits together.
If there is one investing strategy that tends to excite more skepticism than any other, it is the sandwich lease option. Some investors, even seasoned investors, have a hard time adapting the strategy to what they see and need in their respective market areas. However, sandwich lease options are very viable as an investing strategy that can be modified to work in virtually any market condition. In this section, we will focus on the things that need to be done to get a sandwich lease option to work anywhere and in any market. As a general rule, when you approach a seller with the goal of proposing a sandwich lease option, regardless of the area or market condition, you should say something to the effect of, "Mr. or Mrs. Seller, I don't know if this is a fit for you, but I may be able to solve your housing problem." Why do you refer to their house as a problem? Well, recall, you should be focusing on motivated sellers, and if they are truly motivated, chances are they are looking at their home and its current mortgage as a problem. So commiserate with them a little as you begin to introduce your idea. Then ask them a few questions on your way to seeing if a sandwich lease option would work for them. After showing a little empathy to the seller, ask them a few questions, such as, do you currently have a mortgage on the property? What is your monthly payment? Is the interest rate fixed or variable? Then tell them that you can help them if they are willing to work with you. Say something like, I can buy your property for top dollar, but I need you to rent it to me for X period of time. I am willing to give you X down payment in advance. Does this seem like something you would be interested in? And if so, how much do you need per month in order for you to do this? Now, obviously, you will have to have done your homework in advance of talking to the seller, so you will know approximately how much time you will need them to rent it to you, and you will have an idea of how much you can offer them in a down payment and monthly rent amount. Then, after you've said something like this, and here's the key, listen. Sit back and really listen to what they have to say, because it is through good listening that you will know what you need to do when structuring the deal to make it most appealing to the seller and most profitable for you.
With a traditional sandwich lease option, after the agreements have been signed, you sort of sit back and collect profit while waiting for the tenant buyer to exercise their option. As part of the option agreement, you need to make sure that your tenant buyer lets you know of their intent to exercise their option with enough time for you to exercise the option you have with the original seller. You need to do this because, as you recall, you can't legally sell a property you don't own. You can arrange everything for the sale, but you can't actually sell a property unless you own it. However, if actually buying a property poses a problem for you for whatever reason, then you can simply add a clause in your lease option agreement that gives you the right to assign both agreements to a third party for a fee. Doing this makes the person to whom you assign the agreement responsible for abiding by everything you negotiated when you created the original agreement with the seller. Obviously, the main disadvantage with this is that you don't benefit from all of the potential profit an option can offer. But it is a good way to get out of a property quickly and still make money with a sandwich lease option. Now, before we get into some adaptations of sandwich lease options, let's look at a quick example of a traditional sandwich lease option. This example assumes the investor is able to purchase the property and does not need to assign the option. So the basic process is to find a seller, then talk to them to see how motivated they are and to present your idea of lease optioning their property. Remember to listen closely to what the seller says during this discussion. Through negotiating, you then agree to pay $1,000 down and $1,000 per month with an option to purchase the property in 2 years for $220,000. Next, you go to your buyer's list and find a buyer who is willing to pay $4,000 down, $1,300 a month with a purchase price of $250,000. Running the numbers, you will show that this deal profits you $3,000 from the down payment, $300 per month in rent, and an additional $27,000 when the tenant buyer decides to exercise their option. This is a simple sandwich deal where you are in the middle of the deal, just like the meat in a sandwich. But the question is, can a similar strategy work in a variety of other markets? And the answer is yes, it certainly can with minor adjustments. Bob will now show how it can work if you can only work with rather expensive homes.
Okay, thanks, Janet. One of the biggest questions facing an investor in an area where homes are expensive is how you can sandwich lease option them when the rental market won't support the rent required to turn a monthly profit. For example, if you have a home worth $500,000 and want to rent it out, it would probably rent for $2,000 to maybe $2,500 in most markets. But the problem is that the mortgage on that home is probably around $3,000 to $3,500 a month. So again, how can an investor make money from that scenario using a sandwich lease option? Well, the answer may be as simple as changing your mindset just a little. See, typically when you look for someone to occupy a lease option, you look for someone to rent for a while and then move, thus allowing you to set up another lease option with a new tenant buyer. But when the rent market won't support the underlying mortgage payment, you need to think in terms of finding a buyer, not a renter. Doing so will cause whatever the current rent market is to become irrelevant. So you look for someone who understands that it will take $3,500 to $4,000 a month to move into the home. But then, of course, the question becomes, why wouldn't this person simply buy the home outright and possibly save some money? And of course, the answer is that there are plenty of people out there who make very good money, but they don't have very good credit. They want a nice house, but are denied financing because of their credit. These then are the buyers you need to target with more expensive properties. And when you do, you can run a sandwich lease option just like normal while maintaining the ability to profit from the deal. So what about markets that are not appreciating? How can you make money in 2 years from a property that's value is not constantly increasing? For example, if someone is selling a property now for $250,000, but the market is flat, you won't be able to sell it in 2 years for, say, $280,000. So what do? In this situation, you need to work backwards and use what you know about the market to negotiate with the seller. Start by calculating what you think the property will sell for in 12 to 18 months. For the sake of example, let's assume the number stays at $250,000. Knowing that, you can then go back to the seller with the idea that you need to negotiate a price of $220,000 to $230,000. Now, many times the seller will also know the market is struggling and will understand that it will be difficult for them to get full price for their property. But this is also where it is important to know you are working with a motivated seller. So you combine their motivation with a discussion of how the market is flat, illustrating to the seller that he may have to wait many more months to get someone to offer close to the asking price, but that you are offering relief now if he will just come down on the price a little. If they agree, you simply go back to your buyer's list and find someone who is willing to pay enough to turn a monthly profit and give them the option price of $250,000, which is where the property should still be after a year or so.
As another variation of a sandwich lease option, say you are in the market where buyers and sellers are looking for almost the same numbers. For example, A seller needs at least $1,500 a month to do the deal, but the most a majority of renters can afford is $1,500 a month. With this kind of a situation, it wouldn't appear as though there is room for you to make money. There is. And how much of a profit you can make boils down to your ability to negotiate with both parties. You want both sides to feel like the deal is so close to being done that if they can just give a little, it could be done. Tell the seller that you just can't quite come up with enough to cover the payment they are asking for, but if they came down just a little, you can make it work. Then go to the tenant buyer and tell them that if they could come up with just a little bit more, you can get them into the house. You can go back and forth like this as much as you need in order to create a monthly profit. For example, say you convince the seller to come down merely $140 per month, but at the same time, you convince the tenant buyer to bring in just $160 more a month. By leveraging these two small amounts, you've created a $300 monthly cash flow. And you can do the same thing with the purchase price to build a better outcome on the back end when the tenant buyer exercises their option. Always keep in mind that if you can be flexible and negotiate, you will find there are more deals than you have time to do in any given market. Now that we have gone through some different scenarios, let's take a moment and hear the story about an investor named Jake, who is very ambitious and excited about getting started in real estate. So Jake, would you start out telling us how you got started?
Sure. Before I get started, though, let me tell you that I was a little ambitious and started out rather quickly. You may not want to start out exactly how I did, because it cost a fair amount of money, but it ended up working for me. So I guess just know your budget. Anyway, what I did was bought a list of people who owned property in my city but lived out of state. I created a little postcard to send to them and sent about 3,000 postcards to these out-of-state owners.
Wow, 3,000 cards? That is a pretty quick start. So what happened? Did you get some good responses? And what happened with those who called you?
Okay, well, yeah. I actually had quite a few people call me back. Some seemed like decent leads. Some people who called didn't quite have what I was looking for. And of course, some called wondering where I got their information and to have me take them off my calling list. But there was one guy in particular, an older gentleman from Texas, who called and said that he had some property in a fairly desirable area, but that also had some less than desirable tenants. He told me that they hadn't paid rent on over 2 months and had trashed the home and ruined the carpets. I decided to take a look at his property, but only because he was such a nice guy. So I went over and sure enough, it was pretty beat up. But I ran some numbers and figured out it would be worth about $75,000 after it was fixed up and that it needed roughly $5,000 in repairs. In our initial conversation, I found out that the guy was renting it for $600 a month, which, as it turned out, was a bit low for the rent in the area. He also told me that his loan balance was around $55,000 with payments of $550 per month on a fixed interest rate. The guy just wanted to get rid of the property, and I wanted to help, but I didn't have enough money to just buy him out. So I offered an alternative solution. I told him that I would rent the property for $550 a month for 2 years and that I would take care of removing the tenants and repairing the property if he would let me buy the home at the end of the 2 years for $55,000. Much to my surprise, the man agreed right on the phone. So we faxed documents back and forth and completed the deal. Well, I was really excited because I had my first real deal. But then I realized I had not one, but 2 problems. First was I had some potentially uncooperative tenants on my hands, and second, I didn't have any money to fix the property, much less pay the rent. Well, after some deliberation, I decided to take care of the tenants first. I remembered from my training that you can often bribe bad tenants to leave just to free up the property. So I decided to go into the conversation offering them $200 to just move out. Again, much to my surprise, they volunteered to move out, and the issue of me paying them never even came up. Once the tenants were gone, I had to focus on my other problem, fixing the property up. But again, I had no money. In fact, I had literally given my last $100 to the guy in Texas to get into the property. I had nothing. However, I thought I'd run a classified ad in the local newspaper and see what happened. Since I didn't have any money to waste, I had to keep my ad super short. So all I put in it was rent to own, low down, you fix, large house, and then my phone number. You might not believe it, but I received over 100 calls in response to that ad. After sorting through my list, I called a few back and told them they could move in for $1,500 down, $750 a month, with $200 of that being credited toward the final purchase price each month it was on time, and a final purchase price of $75,000 after 2 years. One of the people I called actually offered me $3,500 down and $575 a month. After thinking it over, I decided that would be okay by me since it put more money in my pocket at the time as opposed to making me wait for it. As an added bonus, the husband was a handyman who cleaned up the home and fixed it at their own expense. So, thus far, I had only put $130 into the deal, $100 to the seller to lock in the option, and $30 for a newspaper ad. And I had $3,500 in my pocket with an additional $25 each month. Now, the tenant had terrible credit, which is one of the reasons they liked the lease option so much. Well, over the next 6 or 7 months, I worked with the tenants and a lender to try and get them to set up for a loan to buy the home. It was a little difficult and frustrating at times, but we ended up getting everything worked out and the tenants bought the home for $75,000. After closing with the man in Texas and then the tenants, I walked away from the second closing with $20,000 in my pocket, all from an original investment of only $130.
I would be glad to. And congratulations, Jake. That is excellent. You too can do a deal similar to Jake. You just have to keep an eye out for them and make the effort. So let's go ahead and talk more about the things we can learn from Jake's experience. The first thing, as an investor interested in sandwich lease options, you should not be concerned about fixing properties. Instead, your concern should be on fixing financing. Recall from Jake's story, he never picked up a hammer, he never used a paintbrush, and he didn't even spend any money on materials. Instead, he created desirable terms for a couple on his buyer's list and helped them work on their bad credit problems while they fixed the house. The second thing we can learn from Jake's example is that you don't need to borrow from banks to buy property. See, anytime you go to a bank for a loan, you have to deal with their strict policies and qualification requirements. And if you don't fit their mold, you're out of luck. But we don't need to worry about banks because we understand that with creative financing, we can turn a higher profit by investing less money and not risking our own credit. A third thing that can be taken from Jake's story is that you don't need to own property to make money from it. You just need to control it. Owning property has traditionally been a great way to make money in real estate. But when banks crack down on lending and money becomes harder to get, some of the quickest and easiest ways to make money in real estate don't require property ownership.
Great. We have just talked about several ways to make a good profit using sandwich lease options in a variety of settings. Hopefully, you can see that when done correctly and even creatively, there's really no way that you won't make money with sandwich lease options. But let's take a minute and go through the entire process step by step so that you can see exactly how a deal plays out. To better illustrate the process, I will break it into 2 parts. The first is your agreement with the seller, and the second is your agreement with the tenant buyer. The first thing you need to do is find a motivated seller who is willing to enter into a lease option with you. Then, through negotiation, provide a small amount down. Now, traditionally, your down should come up front, but as with anything else, that is negotiable. Some sellers will be willing to lower or even waive the down in exchange for larger monthly payments. Similarly, others will be willing to allow you to pay the down through a series of slightly higher monthly payments. The big thing is that you use your ability to negotiate and strike a deal that works out well for both you and the seller. Next, you need to negotiate the specific terms of the lease agreement. Some of the things you should look out for are to make major repairs over $500, the seller's responsibility, and minor repairs under $500, your responsibility. But keep in mind, you will pass this repair responsibility on to your tenant buyer. Also, make sure the lease term ends when the option comes due. Verify that your agreement follows local lease laws in terms of their allowable length. Also bear in mind that your lease and option time with the seller needs to be longer than the lease and option time you establish with your tenant buyer. Try to get the seller to give you rent or credit options that will be applied to the final purchase price, a lease that can be renegotiated and renewed, as well as the ability to sublease and assign the option. These things will help ensure your overall safety in the deal. Finally, make sure the option agreement locks in the future purchase price, that the title remains in the seller's name until the option is exercised, and that there are two separate agreements used, one for the lease and another for the option. The second part of setting up a sandwich lease option is your agreement with the tenant buyer. So to start that off, you need to search your buyer's list for someone whose needs are met by the property you have available. Then, collect a down payment from the tenant buyer that is higher than the down payment you gave to the seller. Next, you need to negotiate the terms of the lease. Some of the things you want to watch out for include indicating that major repairs over $500 are the responsibility of the homeowner, and repairs under $500 are the responsibility of the tenant buyer. Also, that the lease term ends when the option comes due. Again, with this, make sure you abide by local laws and that the lease term you offer is shorter than that you have with the property owner. This ensures you have adequate time to exercise your option before the tenant exercises theirs. Along with this is to include a minimum notification time the tenant buyer has to abide by when they want to exercise their option. For example, you may require the tenant buyer to give you 2 months' notice before they plan on exercising or renewing the option. Also, include any rent credits or considerations you plan on giving the tenant buyer along with the restrictions for getting those credits. For example, the tenant buyer has to make their payment on time in order to qualify for the $150 rent credit you offer. Recall, you don't have to offer credits, but if you do, make it very clear what you are offering as well as make sure you preserve your monthly profit. You should also think about whether or not you will allow the lease and option agreements to be renewed. Remember, if you do allow for renewal, make sure it is with the stipulation that the original lease and option agreements be renegotiated as well. Also, recall that we talked about the fact that it is not in your best interest to allow the tenant buyer to sublet or assign their interest in the property. Make sure that you specify how the final purchase price will be established, whether it is locked in or will be determined upon the option being exercised. And the last two things to make sure about are that the title remains in the seller's name until the option is exercised, and that you also use two separate agreements, one for the lease and one for the option.
All right, let's move on to discussing how to best protect your sandwich lease option. As you may recall in the lease option introduction lesson, you learned about why it is important to protect your option as well as several steps you can take in order to best protect it. Each of the ideas presented in that lesson still applies to sandwich lease options. Let me take just a minute and review some of the items mentioned. First, you can record your option in the public records. Second, escrow the deed or a quitclaim deed. And third, you can set up a trust that includes the property but also identifies each party's rights and responsibilities as they pertain to the deal. So those are some of the ideas to protect your option. But recall, a sandwich lease option has two sides, so there are a couple of extra steps to take in order to ensure both sides are protected. The first has to do with the fact that, as a lease option holder, you don't have insurable interest in the property. Consequently, you can't get insurance on it. Therefore, you need to make sure the property owner purchases a landlord insurance policy that covers fire, vandalism, and loss of rent. When they set the policy up, all you have to do is make sure that they are listed as an additional insured, so you will be notified if there is a change or cancellation of the policy. Obviously, if there is a major change or if the policy gets canceled, you simply go back to the owner and ask them to have the insurance reinstated so that you are better protected. Most owners are willing to do this, but they may ask that you pay for it by adding the cost to your monthly payment. The second step you can take is to make sure your tenant buyer has a renter's insurance policy that covers fire, vandalism, and their personal property. You should be listed as an additional insured on this policy as well. Having both of these insurance policies provides a safety net in the event that the home receives major damage. See, sometimes the damage done by a fire or vandalism is more than you have the ability to pay for, and without insurance, you may end up losing the property or possibly being sued by the homeowner or the tenant buyer. Check with an attorney to find out the laws in your area regarding who might be held responsible for damages in a lease option, so you know for certain you are in compliance. A third step you can take to protect your option is to set up an escrow account to have the property owner's mortgage payment made for them. Now, I realize that previously we have said that you can't make that payment because you run the risk of the lender finding out and accelerating the mortgage. But if you use an escrow company to act as a middleman, you can have a hand in making sure the payment gets made. Who knows? You may even be able to get the cost of this service deducted from your monthly payment or from the overall purchase price. So check with some escrow companies in your area to see if they offer any services that ensure a property owner's payment gets made.
Those certainly are some great ideas, Bob. And there is one more aspect of protecting your option that you should be aware of, and that is disclosures. Disclosures are a rather popular legal trend in all aspects of real estate right now. And it has become so popular that some states have adopted some rather extensive disclosure requirements on sales and leases. For example, California has a seismic hazard disclosure for some areas. Ohio requires some pretty specific property disclosures regarding the condition of the property upon execution of a lease option agreement. And many other states have adopted radon gas disclosures. There are even federal laws that require certain disclosures. For example, the lead-based paint disclosure that requires the lessor of a property built prior to 1979 to disclose any known presence of lead-based paint or other similar hazards in the property. In addition, the tenant buyer must be provided with an EPA pamphlet titled Protect Your Family from Lead in Your Home, as well as a 10-day period to conduct an inspection for lead-based paints. So the point is that since the trend is to disclose so much, it is in your best interest to disclose anything that would be required if the transaction was a sale. It's also a good practice to have your tenant buyer sign and date a document stating that they received and understand each disclosure you provide them.
Okay, let's move on to talk about marketing sandwich lease options. Now, you have learned a lot about marketing for lease options and how to create buyers and sellers lists from previous lessons. But there are a couple of things to keep in mind specific to marketing sandwich lease options. For example, one of the best places to look for sandwich deals is by looking at properties for rent. When you find one, get in touch with the landlord and make an appointment to see the property. Once you have the appointment, and before going to the property, make sure that you do some homework on it and find out what similar properties in the area are renting and selling for. Then after you have visited the property to make sure you are still interested, ask the landlord why they are renting as opposed to selling. You will find that frequently the landlord is renting simply because they couldn't sell quickly and didn't know about lease options. Next, ask the seller how much he would be interested in getting if he were to sell. If he gives you a number that is at or below market value for other properties in the area, then you have a great candidate for a lease option because you already know they are willing to lease the property. Another great way to find lease options is to look at properties being sold by realtors. This one can be a little tricky in that you are not super interested in talking to an agent, but rather with the owner. But when you do get a hold of the owner, simply tell them that when their contract with the agent is up, and if the property hasn't sold yet, that you may have a solution for them. Explain that if they would like to sell their property in 30 days, to give you a call in order to make the arrangements. Then give them a business card and wait to see if they'll call. Many won't, but those who do will be desperate and excited for your help. Another great idea is if you happen to have a good agent on your power team, ask them to log into their MLS account and search for expired listings that meet your investment criteria. Then contact the owners of the expired homes and tell them that through a lease option, you can get their home sold quickly. When you talk to these folks, focus on the amount of money they will save by entering into a lease option with you. For example, if they were to sell the home for $100,000 and they did so through an agent, they would lose about 7% in realtor fees. So they are down to roughly $93,000. But then, if they can't find anyone willing to pay full price, that number will drop even further. You then explain that by doing a lease option with you, they don't have to pay the realtor fees and you will pay top dollar for their home. You can also search public records to find people who may be going through eviction, divorce, a death in the family, foreclosure, bankruptcy, or other troubling financial emergencies. Contact these people and see if they would be interested in selling their property quickly and for top dollar. You have seen in this lesson that sandwich lease options can be a very versatile way to get started on a solid investing career. They can be manipulated to be beneficial in virtually any market and financial situation. They are not hard to find and don't require a lot of money in order to make a lot of money. So go out and make it happen. Keep your goals in mind and take what you have learned here and apply it so that you can see these goals become a reality. You can do it, and you now have this information to make it possible.
You have learned some extremely valuable information in this lesson, and now it's up to you to go out and make the knowledge work for you to produce income. Therefore, work hard to get the following action items done before moving on to the next lesson. First, determine if sandwich lease options are an investing strategy you want to pursue. Second, continue building and adding to your cash flow buyers list. Then, determine what kinds of properties your buyers are looking for and can qualify to lease option from you. Then, using the methods discussed, find at least 10 properties that you want to do a sandwich lease option on, and then narrow that list down to 5 as you interview the sellers and do your due diligence on each property. After you have your properties, evaluate and calculate at least 2 to 4 offers using your exit strategy as the basis for the offer amount and option consideration. Make sure you have a licensed inspector evaluate the properties you're interested in sandwich lease optioning to make sure they are in good enough repair. Then, negotiate and finalize your lease option agreement with the seller and offer your option consideration. Make sure the title and supporting documents are escrowed. Finally, secure the sandwich lease option in such a way as you will be gaining positive cash flow over the term of the lease. Practicing these steps over and over will ensure your path to financial freedom as a real estate investor.